Richard Halverson raised his hand and brought it across Danielle Carter's face so hard that the sound cracked through the entire emergency wing like a gunshot. She stumbled backward, 7 months pregnant, her palm flying to her cheek. The room went dead silent. He didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. He just straightened his cufflinks, looked at the stunned staff around him and said, "Now get me someone competent. If you're new here, subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Stay with me until the very end. You will not regret it." Danielle Carter had been on her feet for 11 straight hours. That was nothing new. 11 hours at Hardgrove Medical Center felt like a regular Tuesday. She had worked through worse, through double shifts that bled into the next morning, through holidays, through personal heartbreak she never let show on the floor. She was the kind of nurse other nurses looked up to, the kind that patients remembered by name long after they went home, the kind that kept a calm face even when everything behind her eyes was burning. She was also 7 months pregnant, and her back had been screaming at her since hour 4. But Danielle Carter did not sit down when there was work to do. That was just not who she was. She was standing at the nurse's station reviewing a chart when the automatic doors at the end of the hall burst open. Not slid open, burst, as if someone had kicked them from the other side. Several heads turned. Danielle looked up. 2 men came through first, big and broad in dark suits, eyes scanning the room like they were clearing a threat. Behind them came a third man being half carried by a fourth, his arm wrapped in cloth that had soaked through completely red. And behind all of them, walking like the floor beneath his feet was something he already owned, came Richard Halverson. Danielle had never met Richard Halverson personally, but she knew who he was. Everybody in the city knew who he was. His face had been on the front of the business section more times than she could count. His name was on the new wing of the Children's Hospital 2 miles away. His foundation had donated to Hardgrove itself, a fact that got brought up in staff meetings more often than it should have been. He was 51 years old, silver-haired, perfectly dressed, even now at close to 9 in the evening, and he moved through the world like it had been designed specifically to accommodate him. He walked straight to the nurse's station, not to the triage window, not to the check-in desk, straight to where Danielle was standing. "My associate needs immediate attention," he said. "No hello, no please. Just a statement of demand delivered in the flat, even tone of a man who had never been told no and believed he never would be." Danielle set her chart down calmly. "Sir, I need you to bring him to the triage window. We'll get him assessed right away." "He doesn't need to be assessed. He needs a surgeon. Get me a surgeon." "Sir, I understand you are concerned, and I can see he's injured. But our protocol requires—" "I don't care about your protocol." Halverson's voice dropped half a degree, which somehow made it colder. "Do you know who I am?" Danielle looked at him steadily. "I do. And it doesn't change the protocol, Mr. Halverson." Something moved in his eyes then. Not anger yet, something more like surprise. Like a man who had just discovered that the elevator wasn't working and couldn't quite process it. He wasn't used to the word no. He especially wasn't used to it from someone standing behind a hospital counter in scrubs. "Get me your supervisor," he said. "I am the charge nurse on this floor tonight," Danielle said, "which means I am the supervisor. Now, please, if you'll bring your associate to—" "This is unacceptable." He turned slightly and looked at one of the men in suits. "Someone needs to explain to this woman how things work." The man in the suit said nothing. He looked at Danielle with something that might have been discomfort. Danielle kept her voice level. "Mr. Halverson, your associate is losing blood. The fastest way to get him in front of a doctor is to follow the intake process. I'm not trying to make this difficult. I'm trying to help him." For a moment, it almost seemed like he might listen. He glanced back at his injured associate, who had been lowered into a chair and was breathing in shallow, rapid pulls. Then he looked back at Danielle, and whatever softness had flickered there was already gone. "Fine," he said, "but I want it on record that this is an absolute failure of this institution." "Noted," Danielle said. "Sir, can you give me his name and date of birth?" The next few minutes moved the way they always did, Form's information vitals. Danielle moved efficiently and professionally, sending the injured man, whose name was Patrick, into the first available bay, while simultaneously managing 2 other situations on the floor. She was coordinating with a resident about a patient in Bay 6, checking in on a post-op patient in the hall, and still keeping one eye on the waiting area where Richard Halverson had settled into a chair like a king forced to sit in the wrong throne. He was on his phone, his jaw was tight. He was talking quietly but intensely, and every now and then he looked up at the nurse's station with an expression that made the younger nurses glance away. Danielle noticed but didn't react. She had dealt with entitled family members before. Wealthy ones, powerful ones. Men and women who thought their money bought them a different set of rules inside a hospital. She had learned a long time ago that the only way through it was patience and documentation. She was writing in Patrick's file when Halverson appeared at the station again. "How long?" he said. "A doctor is with him now," Danielle said without looking up. "That's not what I asked. I asked how long." She looked up then. "I can't give you a timeline, sir. The team is working. I need him stable and ready to be transferred to Mercy General within the hour. I have people over there who can actually—" "Mr. Halverson." Danielle's voice was still calm, but there was a line in it now, quiet and clear as a wire. "Your associate is being treated. Any decision about transfer will be made by the physician in charge of his care, not by me and not by you. If you'd like to speak with the attending, I can arrange that once she's finished her initial assessment." He stared at her. "You're being deliberately obstructive." "I'm doing my job." "You're a nurse." "Yes," she said, "I am. And on this floor tonight, that means I make sure every patient gets proper care in the proper order, including yours." Something shifted in his face then. It wasn't the shift of a man reconsidering. It was the shift of a man deciding he had been patient long enough. "I want you removed from this case," he said. "I want someone else handling his care. You don't have the authority to make that request. I'm calling the hospital administrator." "You're welcome to do that," Danielle said. "His number is on the board behind you. But I want to let you know, administrator or not, the protocols here don't change based on who's asking." Halverson pulled out his phone. He made a call. He spoke in a low, sharp voice, and Danielle watched from the corner of her eye while she continued working. She knew what he was doing. She had seen it before. Men like him always had someone they could call, a number that opened doors. She had also seen those calls not work inside this building, at least not completely, not yet. She was pulling up a lab result on the computer when she heard his voice again, closer this time. "I just got off the phone with Mitchell Crane," Halverson said. Mitchell Crane was the hospital's chief operating officer. "He's calling the floor in 10 minutes. I suggest you reconsider your attitude." Danielle turned to face him fully. "My attitude is professional and appropriate, Mr. Halverson. I'm sorry if it's been mistaken for something else. You've been condescending, dismissive, and—" "I've been clear," she said. "There's a difference, see?" He moved closer, not close enough to touch her, but close enough that it was meant to feel like pressure. One of the younger nurses, Tanya, took a step toward the station from the other side. "I want you to hear me very carefully," Halverson said quietly. "I have given more money to this hospital than you will make in your entire career, and you are going to get out of my way." Danielle looked at him for a long, steady moment. Then she said, "And I want you to hear me very carefully, Mr. Halverson. I have taken care of people in this building who didn't have a dime to their name, and people who had more than you, and every single one of them got the same care. That's not going to change tonight. Not for you, not for anyone." She turned back to the computer. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. She heard him move. She started to turn, and then his hand connected with the side of her face so hard her vision went white. The sound was enormous in the quiet of the hallway. A flat, brutal crack that stopped every conversation, every movement, every breath on that floor. Danielle's head snapped to the side. She grabbed the edge of the counter to keep from falling. Her other hand went immediately instinctively to her stomach. She stood there for a moment, not moving, ears ringing, the left side of her face burning like an open flame. Then the silence of the floor broke all at once. Tanya screamed his name, not Halverson's, Danielle's. Someone else shouted, "Call security." A patient in the waiting area stood up. 2 orderlies who had been down the hall came running at the sound. Halverson straightened his jacket. He looked at the room, the open, horrified faces around him, with something that was almost contempt, as if their shock was the inconvenience, not what he had just done. "Get me someone who can do their job," he said to no one in particular. Then he turned and walked back toward the waiting area as if he had simply answered an email. Danielle stood at this counter. She did not cry. She did not move for a moment. Her hand stayed on her stomach. The baby kicked hard as if in response, as if even the child knew something wrong had just happened. Tanya was at her side in seconds. Danielle, are you okay? We need to get you. I'm fine, Danielle said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. You're not fine. Your cheek is we need to document this. We need to call. I know. Danielle straightened slowly. She breathed in. She breathed out. She looked at the room, at the stunned faces of her colleagues, at the security guard now moving toward Halverson, at the patients watching from their chairs with wide eyes. She looked at all of it, and she held herself completely still on the inside, which was the hardest thing she had ever done in her life. Get the attending out of Bay 3, she said to Tanya, her voice steadier than it had any right to be. Patrick's vitals need a second look. I'll handle the documentation. Danielle, Tanya. She finally looked at her. I'm okay. Let me do what I do. Tanya looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded and moved. The security guard, a heavy-set man named Gerald, who had worked the floor for 6 years, reached Halverson and spoke to him in a low, firm voice. Halverson looked at him the way a man looks at a fly on his sleeve. He did not raise his voice. He simply said he was waiting for his associate and that he had no intention of leaving. Gerald came back to the station. He looked at Danielle with an expression that was equal parts regret and helplessness. He's refusing to leave, he said, and he says he's going to file a complaint against you for escalating the situation. Danielle stared at him. He hit me, Gerald. I know. Gerald looked genuinely pained. I saw it. I'm writing it up. But without admin, then get admin. It's almost 10 o'clock, Danielle. Then call them at home. She held his gaze. He struck a pregnant nurse in front of a waiting room full of witnesses. That is not a morning conversation. Gerald nodded slowly. He went back to his station and picked up the phone. Danielle sat down in the chair behind the nurse's counter the first time she had sat down all shift. Her hands were in her lap. She could feel the swelling beginning along her cheekbone. The baby was still moving small, rolling pressure against her ribs, and she pressed her palm there gently. I know, she murmured so quiet no one could hear. I know, baby. We're okay. But even as she said it, she could feel something shifting inside her. Not grief, not yet. Not even anger, not fully. Something quieter and colder than both of those things. The kind of feeling that comes when a person realizes they have just crossed a line they did not know was there and that crossing it has consequences not even they can see yet. Across the waiting room, Richard Halverson was back on his phone. He was already moving on to the next thing, already calculating, already planning, already assuming this would be handled the way everything in his life had been handled quietly, expensively, and in his favor. He had no idea. He had absolutely no idea. In a high-rise apartment across the city, a phone was about to ring, and the man who would answer it had been waiting without knowing it for exactly this kind of call his entire life. His name was Darius Carter, and Richard Halverson had just made the worst mistake of his life. The phone rang twice before Darius Carter picked up. He had been awake. He was almost always awake at this hour, not because of insomnia, but because his mind simply did not power down the way other people's did. He was sitting at the desk in his home office, a half-eaten plate of food pushed to the side papers, spread in front of him, that had nothing to do with what was about to change his entire night. He saw Tanya's name on the screen, Danielle's coworker, a woman he had met maybe twice at hospital events, and something in his chest tightened before he even answered. Tanya. Darius. Her voice was wrong immediately, too high, too careful. I need you to stay calm. He was already standing. Where is she? She's here. She's okay. The baby's okay. But something happened tonight and she didn't want me to call you. She told me not to, but I'm calling anyway because somebody needs to know. And she's sitting there pretending she's fine. And she is not fine, Darius. She is not fine. Tanya, his voice was flat and controlled in the way that only people who have learned to hold enormous things very still can manage. Tell me what happened. Tanya told him. She told him all of it, the arrival, the demands, the confrontation at the nurse's station, the phone call to Mitchell Crane the moment Halverson stepped closer. And then she told him about the slap. She heard Darius go completely silent on the other end, and she kept talking because the silence from Darius Carter was more frightening than shouting from anyone else. He hit her, Tanya said, in front of everybody, in front of patients. She was standing there 7 months pregnant, and he hit her across the face, and then he walked away. Like she was nothing. Like it was nothing. The silence on the phone stretched for 3 full seconds. Is she still on the floor? Darius asked. Yes, she won't leave. You know how she is. She's sitting there documenting everything and telling everyone she's fine. I'm on my way. Darius, she's going to be upset that I called. I know. He was already moving. Thank you, Tanya. He hung up and stood in the middle of his office for exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds in which something very fundamental shifted behind his eyes. Then he picked up a different phone, not his personal cell, but the one he kept in the top drawer of his desk, and he made 2 calls before he even left the room. The first was short, the second was shorter. Both were answered on the first ring because calls from Darius Carter at 10:30 at night were the kind of calls people answered on the first ring. Then he put on his coat and he walked out the door. Darius Carter was 44 years old. He was 6'2", built like someone who had grown up hauling things with his hands and never stopped, with a face that was their father's face, strong jaw, deep-set eyes, the kind of stillness that people either found reassuring or frightening, depending on which side of it they were on. He was not famous the way Halverson was famous. His name did not appear in newspapers. He preferred it that way, and he had spent considerable energy making sure it stayed that way. But within certain circles, legal, financial, governmental, the kind that operated several floors above what most people ever saw, Darius Carter was known. He was known precisely and completely. He had built that quietly. He had built that on purpose. And tonight, for the first time in a very long time, he was going to let it show. Back at Hardgrove, Danielle was still at the nurse's station. The left side of her face had swollen enough that Tanya had brought her a cold pack, which Danielle held there absently while she typed with her free hand. Around her, the floor had resumed its rhythm. Patients needed attention. Charts needed updating. The world did not pause for personal crises. Danielle understood that better than most. She had been the one reminding others of it for years. But underneath the professional surface, something was cracking. It had started when Mitchell Crane called. The phone at the nurse's station had rung at 10:17, and Danielle had answered it herself because she was sitting right there, and because she was not going to avoid anything tonight. Mitchell Crane's voice had been smooth and careful, in the way of a man choosing his words like they were landmines. Danielle, Serti, I heard there was an incident. There was, she said. Richard Halverson struck me across the face. I'm documenting it now, and I'll need a copy sent to HR and... Let's slow down for a second. Crane's voice dropped. I've already spoken with Mr. Halverson's office. He's describing the situation very differently. He says you were combative, that the encounter escalated, and that physical contact, if it occurred, was... Mitchell. Her voice was so quiet it was almost soft. He hit me in front of 15 people. A pause. I understand you feel strongly. I don't feel strongly. I have 15 witnesses and a bruise that's going to need medical documentation. She paused. Are you calling to talk me out of filing a report? Another pause. Longer this time. I'm calling to make sure we handle this in a way that's best for everyone, Crane said. Danielle set the coal pack down on the counter. Her hand was steady. I see, she said. Thank you for calling Mitchell. And she hung up. She sat there for a moment. Then she picked the coal pack back up and pressed it to her face and thought about her brother. She had not called Darius. She had made that decision the moment she sat down. Darius loved her in a way that was sometimes too large for ordinary situations, and this, even as serious as it was still a situation she intended to handle herself. She had always handled things herself. That was the Carter way, their mother had said. You stand on your own feet until you physically cannot, and even then you look for a way to stand again. But Danielle was tired, and her face hurt, and her baby was pressing against her ribs in a way that felt like worry, if babies could worry, and she was just very tired. She was still sitting there when the elevator at the end of the hall opened and her brother walked through the door. She saw him before he saw her. She watched him cross the floor, and she watched the staff around her notice him, the way people always noticed Darius, without knowing why, some animal instinct that registered something different about the way he moved. He was not moving fast. He didn't need to. Every step was deliberate, and his eyes had found her the moment he cleared the elevator, and they did not leave her face. He reached the station. He looked at her, at the swelling, at the cold pack, at the careful way she was holding herself together, and for just a moment, something moved across his face that was entirely unguarded. Something that looked like pain, like grief, like the expression of a man who would set the entire world on fire if it meant taking back the last hour. Then it was gone and he was composed again. "Hey," he said softly. "Tanya called you." Danielle said. "She did. I told her not to." She didn't listen. He moved around the edge of the station and crouched down in front of her so they were eye level. He looked at her face without touching it. "Tell me you saw a doctor." "I'm fine. Danny." "The baby's fine. I'm fine. It looks worse than—" "Tell me you saw a doctor," he said again. Quiet, unmovable. She exhaled. "Dr. Reeves checked me out in Bay 2. Baby's fine, no concerns. Soft tissue bruising, nothing broken." Darius nodded once. He stood up. He looked toward the waiting area at the far end of the hall where Richard Halverson was still still on his phone, still unaware of what had just walked through the elevator. "He's still here," Danielle said. "I know." "Darius!" She grabbed his arm. "Don't." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back at her face. "I'm not going to do anything here," he said. "This isn't the place." "Then why are you looking at him like that?" "Like what?" "Like you're measuring something." He said nothing for a moment. "Then Mitchell Crane called you." It wasn't a question. She saw in his expression that he already knew that whoever he had called from his office before he left had already told him. She didn't ask how. With Darius, she had stopped asking how a long time ago. "Yes," she said. "What did he say?" She told him. She watched Darius's jaw tighten incrementally with each word, the way a cable tightens under increasing weight, almost imperceptible until it snaps. "He asked you to stay quiet," Darius said. "He suggested we handle it in a way that was best for everyone," meaning best for Halverson. "Meaning best for the foundation money," Danielle said. She looked down at her hands. "I've been here 9 years, Darius. 9 years. And Mitchell Crane called me within 20 minutes of that man making a phone call, and he didn't once ask if I was okay." The silence that followed was very specific. It was the silence of a decision being made. "I need you to go home," Darius said. "I still have 3 hours left on my shift." "Danny." "I finished my shift," she said, and there was something in her voice that even Darius did not push against. "I always finish my shift. He does not take that from me, too." Darius looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Okay," he said. "Okay, I'll be in the waiting area." "You don't have to." "I'm going to sit in the waiting area," he said, with the calm finality of a man who has already decided and is not interested in further discussion. "Drink some water, eat something if Tanya can find you anything. And when your shift is over, I'm driving you home." She wanted to argue. She could see from his face that arguing would be purely decorative. She picked up her cold pack and turned back to her computer. Darius walked to the waiting area. He did not walk toward Halverson. He chose a seat on the far side of the room near the window, and he sat down and he took out his phone and he began to work. To anyone watching, he looked like a man passing time, a family member waiting for news. Richard Halverson looked up, once registered him with the brief categorical glance he gave to everyone who was not immediately useful, and looked back at his phone. He did not recognize Darius. There was no reason he would have. Their worlds had never intersected. That was about to change in ways Halverson could not have imagined, but in that moment in that waiting room, he looked at Darius Carter and saw nothing. A man in a chair. Background. That was his second mistake of the night. At 11:40, Patrick was stabilized, and the attending Dr. Yolanda Reeves, a woman who had the bedside manner of a surgeon and the patience of someone who had seen every variety of human behavior and was no longer surprised by any of it, came out to speak with Halverson. She was professional and thorough. She told him Patrick had lost significant blood, that he was stable and resting, and that a transfer to another facility tonight was not medically advisable. Halverson did not thank her. He listened to ask 2 questions about timeline and turned away before she had finished her final sentence. Dr. Reeves walked back to the station. She stopped next to Danielle, who was updating a chart. She did not say anything for a moment. Then very quietly, "I put my full account in writing an hour ago and sent it to the chief of medicine hospital, legal, and my own personal attorney." Danielle looked up at her. What he did tonight was criminal, Dr. Reeves said, and whoever tries to make it something smaller than that is going to have a problem with me. I want you to know that. Danielle's throat tightened. Thank you, Yolanda. Don't thank me, just make sure you file everything. Dr. Reeves put a hand briefly on her shoulder and moved on. By midnight, two more things happened that Danielle would not fully understand until later. The first, Gerald, the security guard, came to tell her that he had reviewed the waiting room footage and confirmed that the camera angle clearly captured the moment of impact. He had already made a copy and secured it on a separate drive. He slid a small piece of paper across the counter with the case number on it. Police report's already filed, he said. I did it an hour ago. I didn't wait for admin, and I don't answer to Mitchell Crane. He met her eyes. I've got kids, Danielle. I couldn't sit on this. She looked at the case number. Something released inside her chest. Not relief exactly, more like the first solid ground she had felt all night. The second thing, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It said only, I know what happened tonight. We need to talk. I've been waiting for an opportunity like this for 2 years. Do not file with HR before we speak. There are things about Halverson you don't know. She stared at the message for a long time. Then she looked across the waiting room and at her brother, who was still sitting by the window, still apparently reading something on his phone, still perfectly still. She did not show him the text. Not yet, not tonight. But she saved the number. At 12:45 in the morning, Danielle Carter finished her shift. She handed off to the night charge nurse, she collected her things, and she walked to the waiting area where her brother stood up without a word and fell into step beside her. They passed Richard Halverson on the way out. He was finally standing and preparing to leave himself, saying something into his phone about sending a car. He glanced at them as they passed, the kind of glance that registered nothing, that filed them both under irrelevant, and moved on. Neither of them said anything. They walked through the automatic doors and into the night air, and Danielle breathed it in, cold and sharp and clean, and felt the tears she had been holding back all night finally press against the backs of her eyes. She did not let them fall. Not yet. She was still too close to the building, still too close to the shift, still too close to the moment. Darius unlocked his car. They got in. He started the engine and sat there for a moment without driving. Talk to me, he said. Not yet, she said. Just drive. He drove, and somewhere behind them in the parking garage, Richard Halverson was getting into the back of a black car and telling his driver to take him home, already mentally composing the conversation he would have with his lawyer in the morning. Already calculating how much it would cost to make this go away. Already moving forward with the absolute certainty that men like him had always carried, that the world would rearrange itself as it always had to accommodate him. He had no idea that the man who had just walked past him in the waiting room had already made 3 phone calls. No idea that by morning, 2 people Halverson had wronged in the past were going to come forward. No idea that Gerald's security footage was sitting safely beyond anyone's reach. No idea that a doctor had already contacted her attorney. No idea that a text had been sent to Danielle's phone from someone on the inside of his own organization. He had hit a pregnant nurse in a hospital waiting room and walked away clean. At least that was what he thought. Danielle did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark of her bedroom with one hand on her stomach and the other pressed flat against the mattress, staring at the ceiling, counting the baby's movements the way she had learned to do in her second trimester. Small reassurances in the dark, proof that something inside her was still steady, even when everything outside was not. The baby moved. She counted. She breathed. Darius had stayed until 2 in the morning. He had made her eat something, toast and eggs, simple and quiet, and he had sat across the kitchen table from her while she talked, and he had listened. The way he always listened, completely and without interruption, his hands folded in front of him, his face still. She had told him everything. The arrival, the demands, the phone call from Crane, the slap, the text from the unknown number. She had shown him the text last, sliding her phone across the table and watching his eyes move across the words. He had read it twice. Then he had set the phone down and said, "Don't respond to that yet." "Who do you think it is?" she asked. "I have some ideas," he said. And that was all he said, which meant he had more than ideas, which meant he had already started pulling threads she didn't even know existed. That was Darius. He was always 10 steps into something before he told you he had taken the first one. He had made her promise to call her OB first thing in the morning. He had checked every lock in her apartment before he left. And at the door, he had hugged her, the kind of hug that said everything neither of them could put into words, the kind that went back to childhood, to their mother's kitchen, to every hard thing they had ever gotten through by standing next to each other. "You're not alone in this," he said into the top of her head. "I know," she said. She did know. But knowing it and feeling it were different things at 2 in the morning when the apartment was quiet and the bruise on her face was throbbing, and she was trying to figure out how to be brave for a baby who was depending on her to be okay. She was not okay. She was close to okay. She was working on it. By 6 in the morning, she had given up on sleep entirely. She was at the kitchen table with her phone and a cup of decaf, and the text from the unknown number was open on her screen again. She read it a fourth time. "Do not file with HR before we speak. There are things about Halverson you don't know." She typed, "Who are you?" She stared at it for a moment, then she sent it. The response came back in under a minute, which told her that whoever this was had been waiting, had been watching, had their phone in their hand. The response said, "My name is Carol Sims. I was Halverson's executive assistant for 6 years. I left 8 months ago. I kept records of everything, everything. Please meet me." Danielle set the phone down. Her heart was beating faster than it should have been. She picked the phone back up and called her brother. He answered on the first ring. He had clearly been awake too. "She says her name is Carol Sims," Danielle said. "Former executive assistant, 6 years. She says she kept records." A pause. Carol Sims. Something in his voice shifted in a way she recognized the sound of a piece fitting into a place it was meant to go. "I've heard that name." "From who?" "From someone who told me 8 months ago that a woman had left Halverson's organization with documentation she was too frightened to use." He paused again. "She wasn't frightened enough to delete her contacts list, apparently." "You knew about her?" "I knew about the possibility of her. I didn't know how to find her." A beat. "She found you instead. That's actually better." "Darius, what exactly have you been doing since midnight?" "Working," he said simply. "Don't meet her alone. Send me her number and I'll have someone verify her identity before you sit down with her." "I'm not going to have someone—" "Danny." His voice was patient and immovable. "Please." She exhaled. She sent him the number. She drank her decaf and watched the morning light come through the window and thought about Richard Halverson, waking up in whatever enormous house he lived in, probably well-rested, probably already on his phone with his lawyers, probably already certain that last night was going to cost him a check and nothing more. She thought about Mitchell Crane's careful voice. Best for everyone. She thought about Gerald sliding that case number across the counter in the middle of the night. She thought about Dr. Reeves and her quiet, fierce certainty. What he did tonight was criminal. And she thought about the text. "There are things about Halverson you don't know." The question was not whether to fight. The question had already been answered. The question now was how far this went and how deep and what exactly was buried underneath the surface of a man who had donated to children's hospitals and hit a pregnant nurse and walked away without blinking. She had a feeling she was about to find out. At 9:15 that morning, Halverson's attorney, a compact and expensive man named Warren Lyle, called Hardgrove Medical Center's legal department. He spoke for 22 minutes. The call was documented. What he said in the carefully cushioned language of a man paid to make ugly things sound procedural was that his client disputed the characterization of the previous evening's events, that any physical contact had been inadvertent and a result of an emotionally escalating situation initiated by hospital staff, that his client was prepared to be generous in reaching an informal resolution, and that pursuing formal legal channels would be costly, time-consuming, and ultimately unsuccessful, given his client's resources and reputation. The legal department called Mitchell Crane. Crane called the chief of medicine, Dr. Bernard Walsh, who called Dr. Reeves, who told him flatly that she had already submitted her written account and contacted her own attorney, and that any conversation about informal resolution could be directed to him. Walsh called Crane back. The conversation was short and unpleasant. By 10:30, Crane had called Danielle's personal cell phone 3 times. She did not answer. The third time, he left a voicemail. She listened to it once, then forwarded it directly to her brother and to the attorney she had called that morning, a woman named Patricia Osei, who had been recommended by Dr. Reeves and who had answered Danielle's call at 8 a.m. with the energy of someone who had been ready for exactly this kind of case for a long time. Patricia Osei was 48 years old and had spent 20 years doing civil rights and employment law in this city. She was not a loud attorney. She was not performative. She was the kind of woman who read everything twice, forgot nothing, and asked exactly the right question at exactly the right moment to make the other side realize how much trouble they were in. Within an hour of Danielle's call, she had requested the complete security footage from Gerald, obtained Dr. Reeves's written statement, and sent a letter to Hargrove's legal department that was polite, precise, and had the unmistakable quality of a door being locked from the outside. Danielle sat in Patricia's office at 11 that morning with her hands in her lap and the bruise on her face finally visible in the daylight, purple and swollen along the left cheekbone, impossible to ignore or diminish. Patricia looked at it once when Danielle came in. She did not say anything about it. She took a photograph for the file, offered Danielle water, and got to work. "Tell me everything," Patricia said. "Start before he walked in. Start with your shift." So Danielle told it again. All of it, clean and complete, the way she had documented it, the way a nurse tells a story, factual and sequential, and without editorializing, because facts were enough. Facts in this case were devastating. Patricia listened without interrupting. When Danielle finished, Patricia set her pen down and looked at her directly. "I want to be honest with you about what this looks like from where I'm sitting." "Please," Danielle said. "Criminal assault is straightforward. The video, the witnesses, the documentation, that's not a difficult case. What's more interesting to me is the hospital's response. Mitchell Crane's call to you last night and the voicemails this morning represent potential obstruction and workplace retaliation. If they move to discipline you, reassign you, or create any adverse employment condition as a result of this incident, or your decision to pursue legal action, that becomes a separate, insignificant case." She paused. "And then there's Halverson himself." "The text," Danielle said. "Yes, Carol Sims." Patricia said the name with the recognition of someone who had heard it before, which surprised Danielle enough that she said so. Patricia almost smiled. "2 years ago, I represented a contractor who had done work for Halverson's company. The case settled out of court, and I'm bound by confidentiality. But Carol Sims's name came up during discovery." She paused again, longer this time. "If she has what she says she has, this stops being an assault case and becomes something considerably larger." Danielle felt the words land in her chest like stones dropping into water, rippling outward in every direction. "What do you mean by larger?" "I mean a pattern," Patricia said, "documented and provable, which changes everything about how this plays out." Danielle sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "He thought I was nobody." "I know. He hit me because he thought there was no cost. Because people like him never pay a cost." "I know that too," Patricia said. And then quietly, with the kind of certainty that came from 2 decades of watching people like Halverson finally meet something they couldn't buy, he was wrong. The meeting with Carol Sims happened that afternoon at 3 o'clock at a coffee shop 12 blocks from the hospital. Darius had verified her identity by 2. She was exactly who she said she was, and his contact had added one additional piece of information. Carol Sims had left Halverson's organization after witnessing him demean, manipulate, and in one documented case physically intimidate a junior employee who had since signed a non-disclosure agreement. Carol had not signed one. Carol had been careful about that. She was a small woman in her early 50s, neat and precise in the way of someone who had spent years managing the case of a powerful man's life. She was nervous. Danielle could see it in the way she held her coffee cup with both hands. But underneath the nervousness, there was something harder, something that had been waiting a long time for a reason to come out. Danielle sat across from her. Darius sat beside Danielle, quiet as always, which seemed to both reassure Carol and put her slightly more on edge, because people like Darius had that effect. "I want to say first," Carol began, "that what he did to you last night, I was not surprised. I know that's a terrible thing to say, but I wasn't, because I have watched him do versions of that for 6 years." She stopped, swallowed. "The difference is that he always did it where there were no cameras, or he made sure the people he did it to were too scared or too dependent on their jobs to say anything." She looked at Danielle's bruise. Her jaw tightened. "He miscalculated last night." "Tell me about the records," Darius said. It was the first thing he had said since they sat down. Carol looked at him. She had clearly researched him. She had known who he was when she saw him come in. Danielle could tell by the recognition and the additional layer of tension in her shoulders. 3 external drives, Carol said. Emails, financial records, correspondence regarding 2 civil settlements, that were never made public. Internal communications about a safety violation at one of his construction sites that was buried before it could become an OSHA investigation. And recorded phone calls. She paused. I recorded them legally in a state where one-party consent applies. There are 41 of them. The table was very quiet. Why didn't you come forward before? Danielle asked. Carol's hands tightened around her cup. Because I was afraid, she said plainly. Because I have a daughter in college and a mortgage, and I had watched him destroy people professionally for a lot less than what I was holding. I told myself the right moment would come. She looked at Danielle steadily. When I saw the news alert this morning, someone in that waiting room had posted a brief account online. Nothing detailed, just enough I knew. I knew this was it, because this time there were witnesses. This time there was video. This time he did it to someone who had a brother who... She stopped herself, looked at Darius. Forgive me. Keep going, Darius said. This time it was different, she said. And I was not going to wait for a better moment, because I don't think a better moment was coming. Danielle looked at her for a long time. This woman had carried this for 8 months, had carried it scared and alone, and waiting for something to justify the risk. She looked at Carol Sims, and she felt a rush of something, complicated gratitude and sorrow and anger. All at once anger not at Carol, but at the system that had made Carol afraid, that had made silence the rational choice for so long. I'm glad you called, Danielle said. Carol nodded. Her eyes were bright. She was not going to cry, Danielle could tell, but she was close to it. I have the drives in a safe deposit box, she said. I can have them to your attorney by tomorrow morning. Darius looked at Danielle. Danielle looked back at him. Something passed between them, the look of two people who had grown up in the same house, who understood each other across distances that words couldn't always travel. Tomorrow morning, Danielle said to Carol. Patricia Osei, I'll send you her contact information tonight. Carol exhaled like she had been holding that breath for 8 months. Maybe she had. They parted ways on the sidewalk outside the coffee shop. Carol walked quickly in the opposite direction, her bag held close, already back inside the careful habits of a woman who had learned to move through the world carefully. Danielle watched her go. Darius stood beside her. 3 drives, he said quietly, and 41 recordings, Danielle said. He nodded slowly. Halverson's lawyer called Hardgrove this morning, offering an informal resolution. I know. Patricia told me. He thinks this is a check-writing situation. Danielle put her hand on her stomach, automatic and habitual, the gesture of a woman who had spent 7 months instinctively protecting something precious. Let him think that, she said for now. Darius looked at her, and for the first time since the night before, something that was almost like satisfaction moved across his face. Not cruelty, not revenge. Something quieter and more righteous than either of those things. The expression of a man watching justice start to move slowly, inevitably, in the right direction. He has a gala on Saturday, Darius said. The Halverson Foundation charity dinner. Black tie, 400 guests. Every major donor in the city. He's receiving an award. Danielle looked at her brother. How do you know that? I was already on the guest list, he said. I've been watching him for a while, Danny, for reasons that had nothing to do with you. He paused. Now they do. The evening air was cold around them. Somewhere in the city, Richard Halverson was sitting in a meeting with Warren Lyle, being told that the situation was manageable, being assured that it would be resolved, being given the comfortable certainty that powerful men always reached for when the world pushed back, the certainty that money and lawyers and the weight of reputation could smooth over anything. 4 blocks away, his former executive assistant was retrieving 3 hard drives from a safe deposit box. 2 miles away, a doctor was finishing a written statement for both the police and a civil attorney. A security guard's footage was locked on a server that no hospital administrator could touch. And Darius Carter was already dressed for Saturday. The drives arrived at Patricia Osei's office at 8:50 Thursday morning, delivered by Carol Sims herself, who sat in the reception chair for 20 minutes with her bag in her lap and her hands folded on top of it like a woman in a waiting room who has finally decided to see the doctor about something she has been ignoring for too long. When Patricia came out to greet her, Carol stood up immediately, handed over a padded envelope containing 3 external drives and a 12-page handwritten index of their contents, and said simply, I organized everything by date and by category. The recordings are labeled by subject matter. The financial files are cross-referenced with the corresponding email threads. Then she paused and said, I was his assistant for 6 years. Organization was the one thing he could never take from me. Patricia looked at the envelope. Then she looked at Carol. Would you like to come in and walk me through the index? Carol said yes. She stayed for 2 hours. Danielle was not there for that meeting. She was at her OB's office across town, sitting on the crinkly paper of an exam table, while Dr. Miriam Cho reviewed her chart and asked her questions in the careful, thorough way of a physician who had read the news alert and recognized her patient's name, but was professional enough not to make it the center of the appointment. The baby was fine. Heart rate strong, position, good fluid levels, normal. Danielle lay there listening to the heartbeat on the monitor, that fast, steady drumming that never failed to rearrange something inside her chest, and she stared at the ceiling and let herself feel it fully for the first time since Tuesday night. The relief, the love, the terror that she kept in a box most of the time because opening it too wide made it impossible to function. You're doing remarkably well physically, Dr. Cho said, snapping off her gloves. But I want to be honest with you, Danielle. Acute stress at this stage of pregnancy is something I take seriously. Not alarmist serious. Your body is working very hard. You need rest. I'm scheduled back on shift Friday, Danielle said. Dr. Cho looked at her over the rims of her glasses with the particular expression of a physician who has heard that sentence 100 times and has made peace with how rarely people take the advice that follows. I'm going to recommend medical leave for 2 weeks, not as a punishment, not because you can't handle it, because you have been through a traumatic event and your body is 30 weeks pregnant and it deserves the chance to process this without also carrying a 12-hour shift. Danielle opened her mouth. I know, Dr. Cho said before she could speak. You want to go back. Going back feels like winning. I understand that, but winning means that baby gets here safely. Think about it. Danielle thought about it for the entire drive home. She was still thinking about it when her phone rang and it was Patricia. I've been through the first drive, Patricia said, and there was something in her voice, not excitement exactly, but the controlled energy of a woman who has just found exactly what she was looking for. Carol's index was accurate. What's on here is, Danielle, I need you to understand something. What happened to you on Tuesday night is serious, and we will pursue it completely. But what is on these drives makes Tuesday night look like the visible tip of something much, much larger. Danielle pulled over. She sat with the car idling. Tell me, there are emails from 4 years ago documenting a worker safety complaint at a construction site in the East District. A man named Thomas Greer reported a structural deficiency to site management. The deficiency was flagged internally and then deliberately buried. 3 weeks later, a section of scaffolding collapsed. 2 workers were injured. 1 seriously. Patricia paused. The settlement agreements are on the second drive. Both men signed NDAs. Thomas Greer received a payment and lost his job 6 months later through what was documented internally as a restructuring, but was described in private correspondence as, and I'm reading this directly, handling the Greer situation before it becomes a situation. Danielle felt cold. He knew about the structural problem before the collapse. His site manager knew and reported it up the chain. There are 3 emails that place awareness of the problem within Halverson's direct leadership team 10 days before the incident. Patricia's voice was steady and deliberate. That's not just civil liability, Danielle. That is potentially criminal negligence. And that is before I get to what's on drive 3. What's on drive 3, a pause that lasted exactly long enough to feel significant. A recording, 43 minutes long. Halverson and 2 board members discussing how to allocate foundation funds in a way that Carol's index describes as, and I want to be precise here, self-dealing, directing charitable money toward projects in which Halverson held personal financial interests. Another pause. That is fraud, potentially federal. The line was quiet for a moment. Danielle said, he's receiving a philanthropist award on Saturday. I know, Patricia said. Darius told me. Danielle blinked. You've spoken to Darius. He called me this morning. He's been very helpful. There was a note in Patricia's voice that Danielle couldn't quite place, something between admiration and mild wariness. The tone of someone who has just realized the person they are working with has access to considerably more than they initially appeared to. He's had his own investigation running in parallel Danielle. He was already building a file on Halverson before Tuesday. He's been working with a journalist. Danielle closed her eyes. Of course he has. The journalist's name is Marcus Webb. He writes for the... I know who Marcus Webb is. Everyone who read serious investigative journalism in this city knew Marcus Webb. He had broken 3 major corruption stories in the past 5 years. He was meticulous, he was relentless, and he had never once had a story successfully challenged in court. How long has Darius been working with him? Apparently 7 months, Patricia said. He approached Darius after hearing that Darius had been quietly asking questions about Halverson's construction practices. They've been building a file independently. Carol's drives just gave them everything they were missing. Danielle sat in her car on the side of the road and thought about her brother sitting across from her in the kitchen 2 nights ago, listening to her tell him what happened, with his hands folded and his face still. All that stillness, all that patience, 7 months of quiet, careful work, and then Tuesday night had handed him the final piece in the public moment simultaneously, and he had not said a word about any of it. He had made her eggs and checked her locks and held her at the door and said, "You are not alone in this." She called him immediately after she hung up with Patricia. He answered on the first ring. "You've been investigating him for 7 months, she said. "Plus 6.5, he said without a trace of apology. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't have anything solid enough yet, and because you would have worried." A beat. "And because you would have tried to help, and I didn't want you involved." Darius. "You're 30 weeks pregnant, Danny. I was not going to pull you into something I didn't know the full shape of yet." She pressed her fingers to her forehead. The bruise on her cheek throbbed lightly in the cold of the car. "What is the full shape of it?" "Now, it's a man who is about to stand in front of 400 people on Saturday night and receive an award for generosity, while his foundation may have been used to commit financial fraud, while 2 injured workers signed away their rights under threat, and while video exists of him assaulting a pregnant nurse." He paused. "The shape of it is complete." Danielle breathed in, breathed out. Marcus Webb is going to publish. He's ready to publish. He was ready last month. He was waiting for something that would make it impossible for Halverson to suppress a public incident, a named victim willing to go on record witnesses. Tuesday night gave him all 3. A shorter pause. "He'd like to speak with you, only if you want to. This is your call, not mine." She thought about that for a moment, about Mitchell Crane's smooth voice, about Warren Lyle calling the hospital with his informal resolution, about the 2 workers who had signed ND, as in a room where they were probably scared and alone and certain they had no other options, about Carol Sims holding a coffee cup with both hands and saying, "I was afraid," with the weight of 8 months of silence behind every word. "Set it up," she said. There was something in the way her brother exhaled, then not relief exactly, but the release of a man who has been very carefully carrying something and has just been told he can set it down. "I'll call him this afternoon." "And Darius," she stopped him before he could hang up. "After this is over, you and I are going to have a long conversation about the things you do without telling me." "Absolutely," he said with the tone of a man who fully intended to have that conversation and also fully intended to keep doing exactly as he saw fit. On Friday morning, 2 things happened within an hour of each other that made Warren Lyle's phone ring 4 times in rapid succession. The first was that a detective from the city's criminal division contacted Patricia Osei to confirm that an assault charge had been formally filed against Richard Halverson, based on Gerald's footage, the police report, and the statements of 6 witnesses. A warrant was being prepared. The second was that Hardgrove Medical Center's board of directors received a letter, not from Patricia, not from Danielle, but from an attorney representing Dr. Yolanda Reeves, Tanya Gerald, and 3 other staff members who had witnessed the incident, informing the board that a collective complaint had been filed with the State Medical Labor Board regarding the administration's response to a violent incident on the floor, specifically Mitchell Crane's calls to Danielle and the recorded voicemails urging her not to pursue legal action. The letter used the word retaliation 4 times. It was not subtle. It was not meant to be. Mitchell Crane called Danielle at 9:15. She did not answer. He called again at 9:40. She forwarded both calls to Patricia. At 10 o'clock, Crane called Patricia directly and was on the phone for 11 minutes, during which he apparently said several things he would later wish he had not, because Patricia's expression when she called Danielle afterward was the expression of a woman who has just been handed an unexpected gift. He offered you a settlement, Patricia said. Full reinstatement, back pay for medical leave, and a formal written apology from the hospital. Danielle said nothing for a moment. Before I've even been disciplined or terminated. Correct, which tells us they know exactly how exposed they are. And it tells us they're very worried about what comes out in discovery if this goes to litigation. Patricia paused. My advice is to decline and let them sit with that for a while. We're not done building. Decline, Danielle said immediately. Thought so, Patricia said. That afternoon, Danielle sat across a coffee shop table from Marcus Webb. He was younger than she expected, early 40s, compact and alert, with the kind of careful eyes that cataloged everything they saw without making it obvious. He had a recorder on the table and a notepad beside it. He had asked permission before placing both. I want to be clear about something before we start, he said. This story runs with or without you. The documentation is sufficient. But your account matters. Your name, your face, your words, they matter. Not to make it more sensational. Because you are a person, and what happened to you happened to a person, and I want this story told that way. Danielle looked at him steadily. How long before it publishes? Sunday morning. Online first print Monday. We're coordinating timing with the criminal warrant. He held her gaze. Saturday night, Halverson will be at that gala. Sunday morning, the story goes live. By Monday, every major outlet will have picked it up. Danielle thought about Halverson walking through those automatic doors, his hand on his cufflinks, the sound of impact, and then the silence of the room. The way he had said, "Get me someone competent," and walked away. The absolute comfortable certainty in every step he took. All right, she said, let's start. She talked for 2 hours. Marcus Webb did not rush her, did not redirect her, did not perform sympathy. He simply listened and asked questions, precise, specific questions, that told her he had already done his homework and was checking her account against everything he already knew. She told him about the shift, the arrival, the confrontation, the slap, the coal pack, and Gerald's case number, and Mitchell Crane's careful voice. She told him about Carol's drives. She told him about the 2 workers, Thomas Greer, and the second man whose name she now knew was Raymond Ellis, who had broken 3 ribs in the scaffolding collapse and had walked with a limp ever since, and who was currently living in a rental in the south part of the city, having lost his construction career, having spent 3 years of his settlement on medical bills, having never told his family the full story of what had happened because he had signed a paper saying he couldn't. When she said Raymond Ellis's name, Marcus Webb wrote it down and circled it. He's agreed to speak on record, he said. We reached him yesterday. Your brother helped us find him. Danielle absorbed that. Of course Darius had found Raymond Ellis. Darius had probably found him months ago. By the time she left the coffee shop, the late afternoon sky was the pale gray of coming winter, and she walked to her car slowly, her hand on her stomach, her mind moving through everything at once, the drives, the recordings, the warrant, the story, Saturday night, Sunday morning. The enormous, careful machinery of consequence that had been set in motion by a man who had not expected any consequences at all. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, different from Carol's number, different from anyone she recognized. She almost didn't open it. Then she did. It said, Ms. Carter, my name is Raymond Ellis. I don't know if you know who I am, but I know who you are. And I want you to know that I have been waiting 3 years for someone to be brave enough to make enough noise that people would have to listen. I'm sorry it cost you what it did, and I'm glad you didn't stay quiet. Danielle stood on the sidewalk and read it twice. Her eyes stung. She pressed her lips together and breathed until the stinging passed. Then she typed back, Mr. Ellis, I know exactly who you are, and I'm sorry it took this long. She got in the car. She sat there for a moment. Then she called her brother. Saturday night, she said when he answered. Tell me what you're planning. A pause. I'm planning to attend a gala. Darius. I have a seat at table 7, he said. Front third of the room. Good sightline to the podium. Warren Lyle will be there. Several board members of the foundation. The mayor. Another pause. And Richard Halverson is scheduled to give a 15-minute acceptance speech at 9 o'clock. Danielle felt something settle in her chest. Something heavy and solid and certain. And you're going to let him start it, she said. I'm going to let him start it, Darius confirmed. I want him at the podium. I want the room full. I want every donor and every board member and every person who has ever written him a check or shaken his hand or looked the other way to be sitting in that room when it happens. When what happens? When he finds out, Darius said quietly, that the warrant was issued at 8 o'clock Saturday morning, and that Marcus Webb's story goes live at midnight, and that I am sitting in the front third of that room, not because I crashed the event, but because 7 months ago I purchased a table at this gala under my company name and no one thought to check. A beat. He's going to see me when he walks to that podium, Danny, and he's going to know. Not everything, not yet, but enough. He's going to know that the man sitting at table 7 is connected to the nurse he hit in that hospital. And he's going to feel, maybe for the first time in his life, what it is to stand in front of a room full of people and understand that the ground under your feet has already shifted and there is nothing you can do about it. The line was quiet for a moment. Don't do anything that hurts you, Danielle said. I'm just going to sit there, Darius said. I'm not going to say a word. I'm not going to approach him. I'm just going to sit there and let him see me. A pause. Sometimes that's enough. Danielle looked out the windshield at the gray sky. She thought about her mother, who had raised both of them on the belief that justice was not a gift. It was a thing you built slowly, carefully with your hands and your patience and your refusal to be smaller than the people who wanted you to be. She thought about that now, about everything that had been built in 72 hours by people who had been afraid and decided to stop being afraid. By Carol and her drives, by Gerald and his footage, by Dr. Reeves and her quiet fury, by Raymond Ellis waiting 3 years in a rental in the south part of the city with a limp and an NDA and the hope that one day someone would make enough noise. Okay, she said finally, call me after. I will, he said, get some rest. She drove home, she ate dinner, she sat on the couch with her hand on her stomach and the television on low, and she tried to rest the way Dr. Cho had told her to, and she almost managed it. The baby moved. She counted. Saturday was coming, and Richard Halverson had no idea that every room he was about to walk into had already been rearranged around him invisibly and completely by people he had never thought to fear. Saturday arrived the way significant days sometimes do, quietly without ceremony, as if the world had not been notified of its own importance. Danielle woke at 7. She lay still for a moment, her hand on her stomach, feeling the baby shift and settle. Outside, the city was doing what it always did. Moving, breathing, indifferent to the fact that somewhere across town a man was waking up in a house that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Preparing for an evening he believed would be a celebration, with no idea that it would be the last ordinary morning of his life as he had known it. She got up. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table and read Marcus Webb's draft, which he had sent at 11 the night before with a single line, tell me if anything needs correcting. There was nothing that needed correcting. It was precise and devastating and human in a way that made her throat tighten by the third paragraph, not because it was dramatic, but because it was simply true, and the truth laid out in clean sentences with documented evidence beneath every claim was more powerful than anything embellished could have been. He had included Raymond Ellis. He had included Thomas Greer. He had included the scaffolding collapse, the buried complaint, the NDAs, the foundation recordings. And in the middle of all of it, clear and unflinching, was Tuesday night. The hospital, the nurse's station, the sound that cracked through the emergency wing like a gunshot. She read it twice. Then she set her phone down and drank her tea and sat with the particular feeling of a person who has told the truth and is now waiting for it to land. Patricia called at 9. The warrant was issued at 8:07, she said. Criminal assault, 1 count. The detective assigned to the case will move to serve it Monday morning. They're aware of the gala tonight and have agreed to hold until then, partly as a professional courtesy and partly because his attorney does not yet know the warrant exists. A pause. Warren Lyle is going to have a very unpleasant Sunday. Danielle said, does Halverson know? Not yet. His team is in full celebration mode. They sent a press release to 3 outlets this morning about tonight's award. Patricia's voice carried the dry edge of a woman who had seen this before, the gap between what powerful people believed about themselves and what the evidence showed. He genuinely thinks this is over. He thinks the hospital is contained, the legal situation is manageable, and that Tuesday night was an inconvenience he already paid someone to smooth over. Let him think it, Danielle said. It was exactly what Darius had said 4 days ago, And it landed the same way now, not as cruelty, but as strategy. Let a man who has never been accountable walk forward in his certainty. Let him stand at the podium. Let him hold the award. Let the room be full and the cameras running. Then let the ground open. There's one more thing, Patricia said. The two men, Ellis and Greer, they've both agreed to be named in the story. Greer called me this morning. He said, and I'm quoting him directly, I signed that paper because I had no choice. I want everybody to know I didn't sign it because I thought it was right. A beat. He's been carrying that for 4 years, Danielle. She closed her eyes. I know. This story, when it goes live, is going to move fast. By Monday morning, you are going to need to be prepared for a level of attention that will be significant. I want you to think about how you want to handle media requests. You don't have to speak to anyone you don't choose to, but I want you to be ready. I'll be ready, Danielle said. She spent the rest of the morning quietly. She called Tanya, who had already heard about the warrant through Gerald, and was cycling between elation and anxiety in the way of someone who had done the right thing and was now waiting to find out what it cost. Danielle told her she was proud of her. Tanya cried a little. Danielle let her. She called her OB and accepted the medical leave. 2 weeks. She had fought it for 4 days and then stopped fighting because Dr. Cho was right and because the baby deserved a mother whose nervous system was not running on crisis fuel around the clock. At 2 in the afternoon, her brother called. I'm getting dressed, he said, which was Darius's version of small talk. Don't cause a scene, Danielle said. I never cause scenes, he said, which was not entirely accurate, but was accurate enough for tonight. How are you feeling? Steady, she said, and she meant it. The feeling that had been building all week, that cold, quiet thing underneath the grief and the anger, had resolved into something she recognized now. Not peace exactly, not yet, but clarity. The clarity of a person who has made every decision they needed to make and is now simply waiting for the world to catch up. Darius. She stopped him before he could hang up. Whatever happens tonight, you didn't do this for me. You were already doing this before Tuesday. I know that. I was doing it because it was right, he said. Tuesday just made it personal. A pause. Everything that was right before Tuesday is still right, and everything that's personal stays personal. He said it quietly, and she heard in it the whole of their history, every hard thing, every loss, every moment they had stood next to each other in the dark and refused to let the other one fall. I'll call you after. The gala began at 7, 400 guests, black tie, the kind of event that felt like the city congratulating itself, donors and politicians and board members and the simply wealthy, all assembled to celebrate the Halverson Foundation's annual Philanthropist Award, which this year was going to its founder. A man giving himself an award for generosity using as 3 of Carol's recordings now made clear funds that were partially redirected from the charitable accounts he was being celebrated for. The irony was not lost on Patricia. It was not lost on Marcus Webb. It was apparently entirely lost on the man himself. Richard Halverson arrived at 7:20. He was in his element, shaking hands, receiving compliments, moving through the room with the practiced ease of a man who had been performing this particular version of himself for 30 years. He looked good. He looked comfortable. He looked like a man with absolutely nothing to worry about. He did not see Darius Carter until 8:45. He was crossing the room toward the head table when he glanced toward table 7 and stopped. Not visibly, he was too controlled for that, but something in his stride shifted for exactly 1 step before he corrected it. His eyes moved across Darius's face, and Darius held the eye contact and did not look away, and did not smile, and did not gesture. He simply looked at him with the specific still attention of a man who is holding something the other person cannot see yet. Halverson looked away first. He continued to the head table. He sat down. He picked up his water glass and he took a drink and he set it down, and he did not look back at table 7. But from that moment forward, something had changed in his body. The ease was gone. Something tighter had taken its place, something working behind his eyes that his face was trying very hard to cover. The man next to him said something, and Halverson laughed at exactly the right moment. But the laugh was a second late. At 9 o'clock, the program director took the microphone and began the introduction. The room quieted. Halverson straightened in his chair. He was looking at the podium, not at table 7. The introduction lasted 4 minutes. It covered the foundation's charitable work, the Children's Hospital Wing, the Scholarship Fund, the Community Development Grants. It used words like visionary and transformative and deeply committed. People at the tables nodded. Some applauded at specific lines. The room was warm and approving in the way of rooms full of people who believe they are in the presence of something good. Then Halverson stood. The applause was generous. He buttoned his jacket and walked to the podium and stood behind the microphone and looked out at 400 people who were looking back at him with the expectant faces of a crowd that believes the story they have been told. Darius Carter sat at table 7 with his hands folded on the table in front of him and watched. Halverson found him immediately. In a room of 400 people, his eyes found table 7 in under 3 seconds, which told Darius that he had been thinking about nothing else since 8:45. Halverson looked at him. Darius looked back. And in the space between them, across 30 feet of gala tables and candlelight, and 400 people who knew nothing yet, something passed that was not spoken and did not need to be. Halverson knew. Not everything. Not the drives or the recordings or the warrant or the story going live at midnight. But he felt it. The way a man who has spent 50 years relying on the assumption that the world will accommodate him suddenly feels the accommodation begin to shift. He felt the ground, and the ground was different than it had been this morning, and he didn't know how or why yet, but he felt it, and it showed in his eyes for exactly 3 seconds before he looked down at his notes and began to speak. He gave the speech. He was good at it, polished and self-deprecating in exactly the right measure. Genuinely charming in the way that powerful men sometimes are, the kind of charisma that made you understand how he had gotten this far, how so many rooms had opened for him, how so many people had looked the other way. He spoke about his father and about hard work and about the responsibility of success. He spoke about the Children's Hospital Wing and the families it had served. He held up the award and he smiled. Darius did not look away for a single second of it. When it was over, when the applause had filled the room and Halverson had stepped back from the podium and the program director was moving to close the evening, Darius took out his phone. He sent a single text to Patricia. It said, "Done." Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked out of the gala without speaking to anyone. He did not approach Halverson. He did not make a gesture or a scene. He simply left, and as he passed table 7 for the last time, he felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has held something very carefully for a very long time and has just set it down exactly where it needed to go. At midnight, Marcus Webb's story went live. By 1 in the morning, it had been shared 11,000 times. By 3, it had been picked up by 4 national outlets. By Sunday morning, Richard Halverson's name was on the front of every major news site in the country, above a photograph taken at Tuesday night's gala, the same gala photograph his PR team had sent to press the morning before, and below a headline that contained the words assault, fraud, and cover-up in the same sentence. The story was everything Marcus Webb had built it to be. Meticulous, human, impossible to dismiss. It began with Tuesday night with the emergency wing and the nurses' station and the sound that cracked through the hall like a gunshot. It named Danielle. It quoted her. It included the photograph Patricia had taken of her bruised face on Thursday morning, which Danielle had approved after 3 days of consideration because she had decided that the cost of being seen was less than the cost of being made invisible. The story moved outward from there to the hospital administration's response to Mitchell Crane's voicemails, to the security footage. Then further to Raymond Ellis, who was quoted at length about the scaffolding collapse and the NDA in the 3 years he had spent trying to hold a construction career together with one leg that never healed right. To Thomas Greer, who said plainly that he had reported the structural problem and been told to let it go, and had spent 4 years knowing that he had let it go. To Carol Sims, identified only as a former senior employee whose recordings and financial documents provided the documentary backbone of the fraud allegations. By the time it reached its final section, Halverson standing at a podium the night before receiving a philanthropist award, while a criminal warrant sat in a courthouse with his name on it, the story had built the kind of momentum that does not stop. Warren Lyle called Halverson at 6:15 Sunday morning. The conversation lasted 27 minutes. What was said in it was not recorded, but at 7 o'clock, Halverson's personal social media accounts went dark. At 8, his foundation's website went offline for maintenance. At 9, his PR firm released a statement saying he was aware of the allegations and was cooperating fully with any relevant inquiries, which was the statement of a man who has been told by his lawyer to say nothing and has agreed to say the minimum required version of nothing. On Monday morning at 8:52, detectives rang the doorbell of Richard Halverson's house and served him with a criminal assault warrant. He was arraigned that afternoon. He posted bail without difficulty. But the photograph of him walking into the courthouse in the same expensive coat he had worn to the gala was on the evening news before he had driven home. Mitchell Crane resigned from Hargrove Medical Center on Monday afternoon, citing personal reasons. The board of directors issued a formal statement in acknowledging that the hospital's response to the incident involving Danielle Carter had fallen short of institutional standards and that a full review was underway. It was the carefully worded statement of an institution trying to get ahead of something before it got ahead of them. Patricia read it, noted it, and filed it alongside everything else. 3 days after the story went live, the State Attorney General's office announced it was reviewing the Halverson Foundation's financial records in response to information brought to their attention by a civil attorney. They did not name Patricia Osei. They did not need to. Thomas Greer called Danielle on Wednesday. She hadn't expected it. He had gotten her number from Raymond Ellis, who had gotten it from Marcus Webb, a chain of people finding each other in the aftermath of something that had finally broken into the open. Greer's voice was rough and a little uncertain, the voice of a man who was not used to making calls like this. He said he had read her interview 3 times. He said his wife had cried. He said his kids had asked him questions he had spent 4 years avoiding, and he had finally answered them. "I told my son the truth," Greer said, "about what happened, what I signed, why." A pause. "He's 17. He looked at me and he said, 'Dad, you didn't do anything wrong. And I know that. I've always known that.' But hearing him say it," his voice caught, he stopped. "Thank you," he said finally. "That's all. I just wanted to say that." Danielle sat on her couch with her hand on her stomach and her eyes full, and she said, "Thank you for saying it. Thank you for coming forward. Both of you." After she hung up, she sat for a long time. The apartment was quiet. The baby was moving small and steady, the way the baby always moved, as if entirely unconcerned with the events of the world outside, interested only in the reliable warmth and rhythm of where it already was. Danielle pressed her palm there and felt the movement and breathed. She thought about the moment after the slap, the sound, the white flash of pain, her hand going to her stomach before her brain had even processed what happened. Pure animal instinct, the body protecting the most important thing without being told. She had stood there in the silence of a room that had gone completely still, and she had made a decision without words, without announcement. She was not going to be made smaller by this. She was not going to be quietly managed or efficiently settled or added to the invisible list of people who had swallowed something they should have spit out. She had spent a week being terrified and exhausted and uncertain. She had also spent a week watching a circle of people, a doctor, a security guard, a former assistant, a journalist, 2 injured workers, and her brother come together around a single act of injustice and refuse to let it disappear. None of them had been asked. All of them had chosen. That was the thing about people who had been watching someone like Halverson for years, waiting for the moment. When the noise was finally loud enough to cover their voices, they did not need to be recruited. They needed someone to start. Danielle Carter had started. On a Thursday morning, 8 days after a billionaire had raised his hand in an emergency wing and believed there would be no consequence, Richard Halverson's foundation announced an indefinite suspension of operations pending financial review. His 2 largest corporate partners suspended their associations with him. The children's hospital that bore his donation money quietly removed his name from their planned expansion wing and issued a statement saying they were committed to ensuring their institution reflected their values. That same afternoon, a second criminal complaint was filed, separate from the assault charge related to the financial records on Carroll's drives, by the office of a federal prosecutor who had received a referral from the state attorney general 3 days earlier. Warren Lyle told a reporter off the record that this was far more serious than they had initially anticipated. The reporter, to their credit, found 3 more sources who said the same thing on the record. And Danielle Carter took her medical leave. She slept. She went to her prenatal appointments and listened to her baby's heartbeat and let the sound rearrange her from the inside the way it always did. She answered the calls she chose to answer and declined the ones she didn't. She texted with Dr. Reeves, who was back on the floor and had been told by the new interim administrator, Crane's replacement, that her standing in the department was unchanged and fully supported. She talked to Gerald, who had been quietly commended by the board in the same statement that had managed Crane's departure, and who had responded to the commendation by saying simply that he had done what anyone should have done. She talked to Carol Sims, who was working with an attorney of her own now, and who had received a message from one of Halverson's board members offering to speak to her privately about what she knew, which Carol had forwarded immediately to Patricia, and which Patricia had described as a potential gold mine delivered directly to their doorstep. She talked to her brother every day. On a Friday afternoon, 2 weeks after the night that had changed everything, Danielle stood in the window of her apartment with a cup of tea warming her hands in the late October light coming in thin and golden, and she thought about all of it. Not with the burning urgency of the past 2 weeks, but with the steady, grounded clarity that comes after when the worst has been survived and the right things are in motion and the body is finally allowed to simply be. She thought about what Patricia had said in their first meeting. He thought you were nobody. She had been a 7 months pregnant black nurse working an 11-hour shift in an emergency wing that needed her. She had done her job with the professionalism and care she brought to every shift for 9 years for patients who had no money and patients who had more than they could spend equally and without exception. She had stood her ground because her ground was correct. And a man who had never been told no had decided that the fastest way through her was through her. He had been wrong about all of it. He had been wrong about who she was, wrong about what she would do, wrong about who was watching, wrong about the case. Richard Halverson had walked into that hospital on a Tuesday night and looked at Danielle Carter and seen an obstacle. He had not seen a woman with a brother who had been quietly building a case against him for 7 months. He had not seen a doctor who would have her account in writing within the hour, a security guard who would file a police report without waiting for permission, a former assistant who had been waiting 8 months for a reason to stop being afraid, 2 workers who had been waiting years, a journalist with a nearly finished story who needed only one thing more. He had not seen any of it. He had seen a nurse. He had made the last mistake of his empire on the assumption that she was the kind of person the world would simply move past. The world did not move past Danielle Carter. The world moved because of her. She pressed her hand to her stomach. The baby kicked hard, certain full of the uncomplicated conviction of someone who has never yet been told they cannot. Danielle smiled. She breathed in the golden light in the quiet of the afternoon, in the deep settled knowledge of a woman who had stood up when it cost something and found out exactly what she was made of. She had always known. She had just needed the world to find out too. And now it had.